Hey, Mr. Jett here, lesson number 26, Algebra 2 Trig. We are going to continue looking at some trig today. We've been doing a lot of work with unit circles, so circles dealing with a radius of 1. Today we're going to do a little bit of work when the radius is not 1, and so we're going to look at some unit circles. We're starting to look at the angles in the circle, okay, but now we're going to look at it when the radius is not 1. And so first thing I want you to do is I want you to draw these two angles in standard position. So pause your video, draw these angles. All right, here are the two angles that you should have got. All right, so here's what we're looking at today. The lesson is given a point, find the 6 trig functions. So basically what it's going to do is it's going to give you a point on the terminal side of an angle. Okay, so we just drew two angles, 5 pi over 6 and 330 degrees. So this is going to give us a point. And so what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to create this right triangle using that point. And then once we have that, we're going to be able to find what is sine of that angle. What is sine of theta? What is cosine of theta? What is secant, tangent, cotangent? All right, so we're going to be able to figure out what those 6 trig functions are. So the first thing I want to do is let's just go ahead and graph this point. So the point 5, 12. And so it's going to be an estimate. And so let's say we go over 5 of 12. Let's just say this is the point 512. Okay. And so what this creates, what we can create here is we said this is going to be a point on this terminal side of this angle. And so what we can create is if I draw a dotted line here creating a right angle, what I've created here is I've created this right triangle where this is 5 units because that's my x, and this is 12 units because that's my y. So if we look over here, that's what's going to happen every single time. No matter what this point is that they give us, it's going to create this right triangle where x is this distance, y is this distance here, and then we have this r here. Well, we know r is radius. Okay, and so if I put, and I made a really big circle, or if I put this point 512 on this circle, this is my r right here. Well, I can figure out what r is. And so we can figure out what this r is because really we just have a right triangle here and we know we can find any missing side of a right triangle. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and use our Pythagorean theorem to find that missing side. But when you do that, you should figure out that this is 25, 144 is 169, which is 13. And so we have this angle right here, theta, that we drew by using this point 512. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to find these 6 trig functions. We're going to find sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, cotangent. And so when we look at this, sine is always y over r. Okay, so it's always opposite over hypotenuse. Well, that's y over r. And so we can do this by knowing what x is, by knowing what y is, and now knowing what r is, we can find our sine, cosine, tangent, cosecant, secant, cotangent. So let's go ahead and do that. So sine of theta, sine of our angle, is opposite over hypotenuse, which in this case is y over r. Cosine theta, adjacent over hypotenuse, which in this case is x over r. And finally, tangent, which is opposite over adjacent, in this case is going to be our y over our x. And so it'll always be the same y over r, x over r, y over x. And so we get 12 over 5. And then if we want to do their reciprocals, so cosecant of theta is just the opposite, 13 over 12. Secant theta, reciprocal of cosine, so 13 over 5. And cotangent of theta, reciprocal of tangent, so 5 over All right, let's look at this next example. Same thing. Okay, the only difference is when I look at this one, the 0.8 negative 6 is actually going to be somewhere down here. Okay, so now when I'm working with this 0.8 negative 6, I get the point down here in the fourth quadrant because my y is negative. And so I still have this radius here. I have this angle that's been created. And I have this right triangle that we create. Okay, here's my theta. Here's the angle that I just drew. Here's my x. Here's my y. Here's my r. So first thing I have to do is I have to go ahead and find r. So we know x equals 8. We know y equals negative 6. So we need to use Pythagorean theorem. Remember, it doesn't matter if we use negative 6 or positive 6 right here. It's still going to turn out to be positive. So 64 plus 36 equals r squared. So we're going to get 100 equals r squared. So r equals 10. Okay, and so now we're using those points to find our sine, cosine, tangent. So it means sine of theta is always y over r. So in this case, we're going to get negative 6 over 10. Which simplifies down for us to negative 3/5. Notice now my sine is a negative answer. Cosine theta, x over r. So I'm going to get 8 over 10, which simplifies to 4 over 5. And tangent theta, which gives us y over x. So negative 6 over 8. So negative 3/4. Okay, so notice here, now my sine and my tangent are negative answers. And we're going to talk here in a second about how to know when sine's negative, when cosine's negative, when tangent's negative. Okay, and so then we get simply the reciprocals. So I'm going to get negative 5/3, secant, positive 5/4, cotangent, negative 4/3. Okay, so I talked about how do we know when each of these sine, cosine, which of these trig functions are positive or negative. And so we have this thing that's called all students take calculus. And so if you notice the beginning letter of each of those, all A, students S, take T, and calculus C, it tells us which trig function is positive in that quadrant. And so this first quadrant here is all. Well, that means that all of our trig functions, cosine, sine, and tangent, I don't know why I wrote those backwards, are all positive. Well, that means secant, cosecant, and cotangent are positive as well. Second quadrant, sine, students. That tells us sine is positive, but cosine and tangent are negative. Third quadrant, T for tangent, tells us sine and cosine are negative, and tangent is positive. And then the fourth quadrant, cosine, C for calculus, if we go back to this one here, the fourth quadrant, the only thing that was positive was cosine and secant. So here, sine is negative, cosine is positive, and tangent is negative. Okay, and so this all students take calculus just helps us know which quadrant, what trig functions are positive. All right, I want you guys on your own to go ahead and graph this point and then find the 6 trig functions. All right, here are the answers you should have got. So you should have done Pythagorean theorem to find your radius is square root of 5, and then looked at that to find sine, cosine, tangent, and their reciprocals. Don't forget, we have to rationalize the denominator. So if you get root in the denominator, we have to rationalize it. All right, go ahead and do lesson number 26.